there's no democracy, it must go through. Therefore, I would reduce the 34 to truly democratic countries. In Sri Lanka, we had this. In 2011, the two-term limit was changed by Parliament. And when the presidential elections were held in 2015, we went on the basis that the changing the two-term limit was wrong and to change the then president. And the electorate went along because that we had a democratic system. So we got President Sirisena in, and immediately Parliament, including those who had voted for the original amendment, had to vote for the 19th amendment, which limited the term of office, limited it 2 terms of office. So if you have a democratic system that is functioning, you can some way or other you can oppose it. If your system is not democratic, it is like the referenda that is held in North Korea, 99.9 or 102% vote.
But do you agree there's an erosion, sir, of the democratic process, of the norms?
No, there is, if you look at in some of them, or some of the safeguards. But on the other hand, the world has opened up. A lot more transparent. Even in a non-democratic country, you know what is happening outside. The Maldivian minister knows. I know how we use the system and how we've been able to get back to office. And now the system has thrown some of us out of office. But as long as it's protected. So what's happened now, taking the countries that are not democratic, is that the media, the social media, has opened it up. And therefore, this you find that people are forming opinions, and in different ways, the non-democratic states are also being forced to respond to it.
Dr. Freiberger, a Freedom House report from 2018 noted that since 2006, 113 countries saw a net decline in freedom. And the 2018 Democracy Index of the Economic Intelligence Unit also recorded the quote-unquote worst decline in global democracy in years. Why are more and more countries sliding into authoritarian rule? And do you believe that corruption is a factor?
I think the evaluation that you've just referred to indicates a step backwards from a previous movement of increasing democracy across the world. One of the big steps was the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And that meant that tens of millions of people who had been submitted to an authoritarian system and an authoritarian ideology were freed from this oppression, able to recreate their independence, as the case of Latvia and our neighbors in the Baltic, to have democratic governments and to make a choice in how they are to be governed. There are other parts of the world where the process has gone in the opposite direction. I think that it's very difficult to generalize. The world is exceedingly different in terms of where we start from. For instance, in Africa, a place like the Congo, where a colleague of mine at the Trust Fund for Victims of the International Criminal Court, where we work together with a Congolese lawyer, he reminded us that when the Belgians left the Congo as a colony of the king, there were 3 persons with a university education in the Congo. Obviously, a country so little prepared in terms of the general education of the population is hardly in a position to establish a democracy. So across the world, I would say that the level of literacy, the level of education, the minimal level, the standard of living, those are the preconditions for individuals to be able to participate in any sort of decision-making. And it's a virtuous or a vicious circle, depending on the circumstances. Whether the governance in place prevents the populations from making progress or the other way around.
Let me make it more provocative than David Stewart. Is democracy overrated? Some have said that we do not have the imagination to think of a political system that is other than democracy, and we tend to sell democracy and liberal values as not just the best option, but the only option for countries. But this is not 1930, and tanks will not be out in the streets if we do not have a democratic system.
Well, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst system of all political systems except for all the others. And that, I think, is true. People who live in countries that are not democratic will understand the importance of democracy. But in a democracy, power by definition is in the hands of the people. And the quality of the democracy will depend very much on the degree of education, the degree of responsibility and commitment that the people have to the success of the democracy. And the sad truth is that electorates can be just as corrupt as any other holder of power. And too often these days, in the West, I think, we have elections which are auctions by parties offering the people more and more for less and less. And the only way that governments can meet those promises is to borrow money. And I think this is at the root of a lot of the problems we have in Western democracies now. We need more responsible, better educated voters to make sure that democracy succeeds.
Indeed. You made a very interesting point, Maria Didi, if I could draw on that. He said that electorates can be corrupt as well, and people who vote can be swayed by very personal and very basic motivations. And then the example of China is often given. China is a country that has seen stunning economic rise in the past couple of decades. Its GDP per capita, for instance, has increased 16 times between 1990 and 2017. It has acted against graft, sometimes politically motivated, but it has acted, the government has. And yet China is an authoritarian capitalist state. It is often said in this region, in South Asia, that the China model is the best model. Let's grow economically and then talk about other elitist values. Do you agree with the idea?
Democracy is hard work. It's not easy. It's very easy for countries and people to say, that authoritarian rule is the best, and if you clamp down hard on dissent, that you're going to get a success in economy or things like this. A lot of people do believe in strong rule as well. But if you want a system that is not corrupt, if you want a system that is answerable to the people, if you want a system that is transparent, good governance, then you need democracy. We have had instances in the past in our country as well, where there's been strong hand rule, where all the opposition leaders have been put in jail. Like the last 5 years, we went for an election without having any opposition leaders. They were all in exile or in jail. But it wasn't good for the country. There were so much borrowing as well, and a lot of things were corrupt. So if you want to have a system where, people are answerable, the leaders are answerable, they act for the people, then you need a system where it's transparent and all that. Nowadays, you see that there's social media, there's media as well, but there is, I believe, to some extent, an erosion in democratic norms. I mean, worldwide, you see that on the media. You know, some of the bigger countries, you see where, as a young democratic activist, you know, I've been involved in constitutional making in Maldives, which made the system more transparent, brought in constitutional democracy to the Maldives. But those countries that we aspired to, in my 20 years in Parliament, what we see from the media, there's been an erosion in these democratic norms, and we hope that, you know, social media and other media would pick up on that. I mean, social media can be used in a good way, and social media can be used like the Cambridge Analytica or something to really confuse the electorate as well. So, as you say, in our sort of system, there's a need-based voting system as well, where some of the people, they just go to the electorate and offer certain things and then get their votes. But more and more, I think, as the younger generation come up, you know, we are about more than 50% youth in the country. We are seeing people who are more educated, more based on the manifesto and promises that we offer to the people, rather than those things that we offer as sweeteners when we get the awards from them. So I feel, although there's an erosion of democratic norms to some extent worldwide, there is hope. Thank you.
There is hope indeed. And social media and technology in general can be a double-edged sword, as you said. Dr. Freiberger, has technology, or does technology sometimes tend to hijack democratic processes? We've seen elections being hacked using technology. We've seen authoritarian states or powers monitor their people more closely using technology. Has it contributed to somehow weakening the processes? And we're still trying to come to terms and understand how technology can affect our choices.
Technology, like any other tool, can be used for a variety of purposes. It can be a tremendous support to democratic processes by allowing more people to be informed about the alternatives that the party system in democracies offers to, for instance, in elections. But the most modern technologies have also increased the possibility for fake news and fabricated news. Here again, it is not a new invention. Propaganda, lies, inventions, vicious slander are as old as the world. But nowadays, modern technologies give them greater scope and the ability to reach more people. It has become acknowledged that in the future, not just literacy and digital literacy will be necessary for the maintenance of democracies, but real training since childhood to actually distinguish what is likely to be true news, what corresponds to reality, or what has been totally fabricated. Remembering at the same time that any event that you look at can be looked at from different angles. At the time when Egypt was having the so-called Arab Spring, I remember a representative of Al Jazeera saying that when they went with their cameras on Tahrir Square, they had to choose where to direct the cameras. It was a very large crowd, a very large square. And depending on where you focus the cameras, you do get a slight nuance in how you represent the facts. When Pakistan and India look at the same event, each from their own side, it's like people on two sides of a mountain, each having a different picture of it. Absolute truth, as science has been informing us for the last couple of years, absolute truth is an ideal that we strive for. The best we can hope for is an approximation to the truth that will not be harming our neighbors. In other words, the whole point of democracy is to admit that we may be seeing and looking at things from different angles, interpreting them in a somewhat different way, but maintain the ability and the respect to listen to a dissenting view, to listen to a different opinion, to respect their right to express a different opinion, and then to seek for ways of working together and finding the common good. And this is where China, I think, with the Belt and Road Initiative and this emphasis on the win-win strategies in terms of economic development, has really made a breakthrough. And in the previous panel, when people were talking about economic collaboration being possibly the way forward, it might be one of the ways to overcome long-standing differences of opinion and of feeling, which, by the way, in the European Union of today, the history of Europe is one sad sequence of conflicts and wars over the centuries. The 100 Years' War between France and England. 3 major wars between France and Germany before the Monet and Schuman declaration that put together the resources of the Ruhr region and the coal and steel resources of Europe instead of fighting over them. Democracy has been progressing, yes, with the baby steps, if you like, over the centuries. It is by no means perfect now. Elections are by no means a guarantee of a democratic system just because you have elections. Elections can be falsified, manipulated, and so on and so forth. But it is something that respects the right of individuals to have their own opinions. At the same time, the freedom of every individual has to respect the freedom of others. I think Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher who was born in Riga and spent his life in Great Britain, in his definitions of liberty emphasized that. My liberty, my ability to have a right to my opinions and my choices ends where that of others begins.
Very well said. Mr. Wickramasinghe, some of the self-appointed torchbearers of democratic values seem to be changing course now, and of liberal values as well. We have democracies like the United States, which are separating migrant children from their parents. Australia is infamous for its indefinite confinement of seaborne migrants. And when we see these examples, countries like China, for instance, use them as justification for the crackdown on some of their communities, including the Uyghur Muslims. Do you believe that with these recent developments, the line between authoritarianism and democracy is blurring somewhere?
Who are the torchbearers of democracy? Because you declare them to be torchbearers, now you say you want to lift up the standards. Australia, in my view, is a democratic country. But it has passed laws responding to its public opinion, which has put certain restrictions on people coming in. So I think that's the right of a country. Now we can't say that this Australia is not democratic because you did not, because they have passed those laws. Many of our countries are forced sometimes to pass laws which due to public response, due to security reasons. So as long as the system is democratic, why are you questioning the law? The best example is during war, when they were locking up people during World War II, they went to courts in UK, and there was the House of Lords case, Liversidge versus Anderson, who was the Secretary of State. They locked up Liversidge, and we had these 2 different sets of judgments, one by the majority, one by the minority, where Lord Atkins said that even in the war, the laws are not silent. And sometimes some of the courts have now used the minority judgment, Lord Atkins. But at that time, they'd lock up people. In USA, they went and locked up a whole lot of innocent Japanese. It didn't mean that they ceased to be democratic. Those are questions that can be examined later by that country to decide whether what they did is right or whether what they did is wrong. So that is one. Secondly, you asked about China and Russia. You know, Nikita Khrushchev was not a Democrat at all. He was not liberal, but because of him, the world became a better place. He stopped all the purges of Stalin, of millions and millions of people that Stalin had killed. And then onwards, communism took on a different turn and left to Gorbachev, and Yeltsin, they finished it. Same in China. There was a time of the Cultural Revolution. The president of China was thrown to jail, his clothes were removed. The general secretary's son was thrown out of a building, and so many were killed. That doesn't happen in China today. It doesn't mean it's a multi-party state. But, okay, look at it. At the end of the day, now who's the better man, Hitler or Stalin? If Stalin didn't sacrifice 1 million men in Stalingrad, Hitler still would have ruled the world. But Stalin was able to do it because he ran an autocracy, because he had already killed millions of people. But finally, he defeated Hitler. I'm not saying Stalin is good. They were non-democratic, they were brutal. But how do you draw the line? Why do you call a democratic country non-democratic? Because it has to pass certain laws. Here, you all may agree or not agree with the citizenship amendment. I don't want to get into that. But the fact is, your parliament has passed it, and now its validity is being tested. Sorry, let me finish. Its validity is being tested in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court can say it's legal, or it can say it can strike it down, like in USA. So long as the situation works, that's all that I can say. And if I disagree with the Supreme Court, we still have the freedom to go and argue it. The same in Australia.
Right. I also want to bring in the aspect of engaging youth in global governance. And I have numbers again, David Stewart. Young people aged 15 to 35 make up 1/3 of the world's population. But the average age of parliamentarians the world over is 53. Why is youth largely absent from decision-making forums?
We have the same problem in South Africa. We have millions and millions of young people who haven't even registered to vote. This is in a country where the vote was so important to bring liberation. It's a problem of education, and it's a problem of whether kids feel that they are involved in the process. It's a problem of seeing whether this democracy actually helps them in practice. So I think it's a problem that has to be addressed by better education, by doing much more by political parties to involve young people, by recruiting more and more young people as voters, by registering them. But just returning to the other part of the discussion, you know, the critical variable in successful societies is freedom. Because in a free society, where you are free within the limits of the law, you make votes and decisions for yourself and your family every day that affect your life directly. You vote in an election every 5 years or 4 years. There is an absolute correlation between free societies and virtually all the benefits. Free societies have much higher per capita incomes than the least free societies. They have much higher levels of human development. They're even more equal. So the critical thing is about democracy is that it is the best system to protect and defend and advance freedom. And I think this is the problem that the Chinese are also going to experience. They have increased the level of economic freedom in the country, but that creates enormous pressures in any society for greater freedom. And I think this is the crisis that the Chinese will face in the years and decades to come. And I think that's why they're probably so concerned about what's happening in Hong Kong right now. But getting back to the youth, register the kids, educate them, make sure that political parties involve them.
This is what we were talking about when we said we'll offer solutions as well with the questions. Maria Didi, the Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, is the world's youngest. She is 34 years old, and when she took office, the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, had this to say. He said, "Ask old people for advice." And there was a fair bit of debate on this as well, on why this was being said to her. But I think this is generally the belief that good governance comes with experience. Is that something that you agree with? Do you think we are ready to entrust younger people with taking bigger decisions?
I think it's important to have the youth involved. You see now Greta Thunberg, who is making her voice heard in the climate change issue. We see Malala, who is talking about her hardships and how she wanted younger women to be involved in education. You see a younger participation and encouragement also on the part of the world community to get younger people involved in politics. But you see when they don't participate, the detriment that a country goes to. For instance, I saw on the media and everywhere, when there was Brexit, the older generation voted for Brexit. The younger people wanted them to stay with the EU. But the youth took it for granted that they wouldn't vote Brexit. So their non-participation made the older generation decide for the younger generation in Britain. So I think there are many issues that are involved worldwide, which if the youth thought about it, that they should realize that it's their future, and unless they participate, then there is not going to be a world that is ideal for them to live in, because we move on, generations move on. If the youth participation is not there, then it's difficult. But with social media, you find that we have a very savvy social media educated young people around. They are always on their texts rather than talking. They'd rather talk through texts. You see them on Twitter, you see them on Instagram, you see them on Facebook. But more and more, I feel youth are disillusioned with politics. So I don't like the thought of ageism in politics, but more and more you find, like in the US, there's Bernie Sanders and there's Trump. You know, there seems to be a lot of aging politicians, but in our country, in the Maldives, you find a very young generation in parliament as well, you know. Most of the parliamentarians in our parliament is between the age of 35 and 45. So I think, you know, when they see the older people making decisions for their country which doesn't reflect their views, then instead of disengaging themselves from politics, the younger generation should become more involved in what is going on. And I think if the political parties have youth movements and things that makes it more conducive for people to participate, especially the younger youth, and have them more involved, it will happen. But worryingly, worldwide, we find that the youth are getting more disengaged with politics and more disillusioned, and they think, you know, stepping back and not being involved in decision making is more fashionable. I see a lot of people when I go canvassing on the streets as well, you know, they say, oh, we are not political. But the thing is, their idea of politics and what really is politics is not about something for some other people. It is us. It is them, it is the youth, it's every baby, you know. So children up to the whatever age and the older generation, everyone gets affected by political decisions. And as long as the youth are also aware, and all the media, including social media and all, make them more aware that every decision that they make, you know, whether it's going to the polls or not, and their decision not to put a vote also would make some sort of decision which would affect them.
You mentioned Greta Thunberg, you mentioned Hong Kong. This has been the theme, the overwhelming theme of 2019 and going into 2020, the protests that we've seen and the young people at the forefront of the protests, even though they may not be participating in the political process, they're making their voices heard on the streets. Do you believe that this protest will continue, and why is it that people feel the need to step out? Do they feel that they're not being heard? Do they feel that they're not being taken as stakeholders? Why do they? What explains this uprising?
I believe that the social media have had a great deal of influence on the various demonstrations that we have been seeing and protests across the world. But the participation of young people in politics and everything else in decision-making is part of the democratic process. If in an aging population it would be more natural to have more aged decision makers, but in many parts of the world where the young people are predominant, one would wish to encourage them to enter into politics and various other positions of responsibility as soon as they're able. We have to remember that young people have as a priority finishing their education, frequently, especially for women, creating a family and having children might be a barrier, and it's encouraging to see countries like New Zealand having a prime minister who is able to have a baby while she is a prime minister. This is something that a few years ago we could not picture. But I remember when I was a young professor and living in Canada and started making public lectures on various topics, people would come up to me and say, frankly, I liked your lecture, but I find that you're too young to be a professor. And they expected a professor to be somebody with a grey beard and obviously a man, not a young woman. And I told them that youth was a disease that time would cure in time. And if you look at me, you can see that this is perfectly true. We, old and young people, are not separate races or separate species of humans. We are all on a sort of sliding sidewalk as time goes by. And the youth of today very soon will turn middle age and then will go into old age. All of us have this drop-off point where actually we disappear from the world. So that we should realize that there's no such thing as the old being one closed category, standing there firm and representing their interests, and the youth being another separate, hermetically separated category. We are all on a sliding sidewalk of time, slowly drifting into our old age and into our common humanity, so that we should remember that young or old, we should have truly as our priority, if we wish to make the world better, to make it better for everybody, young and old, and regardless of any other distinctions.
Mr. Vikram Singh, one of the issues that young people seem to have taken to with a lot of gusto is climate action. They're demanding climate action the world over. In 2019, there were a total of 409 natural disasters, and there was a lot of human cost, but the world also lost a whopping $232 billion. And yet the people who were at the forefront of this, like Greta Thunberg, they saw a lot of support, but they also saw some leaders discrediting them, calling them children. Are the leaders of the world prepared to sit across the table with young people and take their feedback and work with them?
Well, I would say that climate change concerns are not limited to the young people.
Indeed.
All of us are. It has sort of become an issue which has brought young people out there, but it certainly is a concern for everyone. The question is, how do you handle it? Then you come to the actual politics of it. There are people who will say, like, okay, I will get back to Australia, where they say climate change is the denial of climate change. So there's a big argument going on after the bushfire. So in these democracies, there are different lobbies. For instance, there are the industries who are responsible for the highest level of emissions. They are not willing to be overnight, to be controlled. So there are three different groups. You see that in USA. So it finally has become a battle among interested groups and lobbies in any democracy as to how can you bring in the necessary legislation, necessary rules. But there is a good report, I think, when Ban Ki-moon was General Secretary of the UN, he appointed a committee, if I'm not wrong, headed by Kofi Annan, and containing climate change. That's a very good book, that report that's out there. What we can do. It's very, very practical. You can't stop everything. But the question is then leadership, going into the parliament, getting the laws enacted. That's the biggest struggle. Then finding the machinery that is capable of implementing it. Getting a law enacted is insufficient. Have you the machinery to implement it? Have you got a judiciary that can dispose of the case within a few months instead of taking 2 decades? So all those issues have to be sorted out.
Right. Since this is a very broad subject, global thinkers and ideas, I'll try to cover as much ground as possible. David Stewart, a lot of people from the continent of Africa are trying to make a living in South Africa. And this has given rise not just to competition, but also some tensions, and there's been violence because it stretches the resources. Do you believe that illegal migration is one of the biggest challenges facing South Africa in particular and the world in general?
No, not necessarily. Strangely enough, nobody has the vaguest idea of how many illegal migrants there are in South Africa. You have estimates between 500,000 and 5 million. But the fact is that they're all contributing to the economy. They're all making a really valuable contribution. They're creating jobs. So it hasn't actually caused a lot of visible problems in the economy. Where it is problematic is that we have a very high level of unemployment among our own people. And of course, people who are unemployed will always resent foreigners, particularly illegal foreigners, who've got jobs. And that has been the source of xenophobia in South Africa. But very often this has been exploited by criminal elements. So it's a complex situation. We have very porous borders. We have a really multicultural population in my city, Cape Town, with people who've come all the way from Somalia, all the way from the Congo to get jobs in the city. It actually makes it a very exciting multicultural, vibrant community, but it also brings tensions.
It does. Maria Didi, the Maldives has contributed, according to one report, the highest number of foreign fighters per capita in Syria. Last month, 3 foreigners were also stabbed. How is the Maldives checking the threat of rising Islamic radicalism?
Radicalism anywhere is not good. We've seen, like, we were talking about radicalization in Maldives for a long time, but suddenly our neighbor Sri Lanka had the Easter Day bombings. Again, in New Zealand, where you would have thought, it's one of the most peaceful countries in the world, we saw a lone wolf, a gunman come and shoot many Muslims as well. So radicalism by itself is no good. If you put it as a percentage, because we are only about 345,000, 400,000 people in Maldives. It sounds a lot, but the exact number of people who've gone as foreign fighters to Syria is not something that we can really put a figure on, because in Maldives it's illegal to go and fight in another country. So they go, and when they do go, we do not have the exact figures. Some estimate it very high, the others, but as per the NCTC, which is the National Counterterrorism Center, we have about 69 foreign fighters with women and children out there in Syria. But the problem is something that needs more thought, because we are talking about an ideal. You know, we are talking about countering a sort of thought that gives people an incentive to go and fight in some other country or fight for something that they are made to believe in. So the only way to counter that is to talk about ideals, about peaceful coexistence in society and things like this. And this is something that we are trying very hard in the Maldives from the beginning to counter the radicalization factors that are there, who've studied in other countries. Actually, in the 1980s and before that, when we were younger, we didn't have this problem in the Maldives. The Maldives is one of the most peaceful places on earth that you could have. Our government, since we were sworn in, have acknowledged that we have a problem. We are trying very hard to counter that by getting more moderate views being espoused, what we believe Islam stands for. But our country is a lot of islands, 187 islands in total, with people dispersed all over. So it's a lot of work, but we are getting there. The first thing, the first positive thing that we have done in the Maldives is to acknowledge that we have a problem there. The second thing is we are identifying those people who are espousing radical views in the country and tackling them on what they are doing, and the acknowledgement of the problem and the tackling of the issues, and then getting people who have more moderate views to go and speak to these people, try to make them understand that we have to coexist in society and live together as very peaceful people.
Dr. Freiberger, Latvia recently signed a joint declaration on 5G security with the United States. Latvia's a joint declaration on 5G security with the US. 5G technology?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And the text of the declaration does not mention Huawei or any country. But what it says is very interesting. Let me quote from the declaration. It says, whether the network hardware and software suppliers are subject, without independent judicial review, to control by a foreign government. This is something that the supplier should take into account. Basically, it is being seen as a reference to the Chinese company Huawei. The question I want to ask you is that do you find yourself caught between the US-China trade war?
We are a small country who do most of our trade relations with the rest of the European Union. Our trade with the United States is insignificant, and the same could be said with China. We're hardly a world power whose trade position would make a difference here. So that as far as I personally am concerned, I could either say a pox on both their houses or rather wish them well in settling their differences.
Right. Mr. Vikramasinghe, the biggest diplomatic challenge it is said, for Sri Lanka at the moment is balancing or striking a balance between India and China. Is that the right assessment, sir, according to you?
No, I would say that is not too much of an issue. We have been friendly with China, and from the time the People's Republic was established, recognized them. We were the first to sign a trade agreement which brought sanctions from US, and we've had this relationship. How can we balance with India? India and we have the same heritage. We have Buddhism, we have Hinduism, Sanskrit and Pali. All we do as a government to ensure whatever we do will not in any way be a threat to the security of India, and what India does will not be a security for us. Other than that, formally both governments can stop trade between the two countries, but the unofficial underground trade that goes on between Sri Lanka and Chennai can't be stopped. It will still carry on. So what's the use? You are talking of fishermen. Those fishermen now live in both sides. Some of our fishermen have wife in Sri Lanka and another one on the other side. So this is so that's all. With China, we are going ahead. But we have no military alliances with anyone, and we are open with all. So when you say balance, no, you're not balancing. One, we are friends. Other, we are all part of a common heritage.
Spoken like a politician.
We are the Rama and the belt.
The rise of the right has been talked about a lot. And there's an interesting theory that some political experts have put forth. They say that this is not really so much about the support for the right ideology as a protest against the present political establishment.
There's a lot of truth in this. I think that in the European Union, also in the United States, among a section of the population, there is a disaffection with the political class, with bureaucrats who are perceived to have been in power for generations. It doesn't make very much difference whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats or the Tories or Labour. They are the people who call the shots. And a lot of people feel marginalized by this. They feel that they're not being listened to. And I think this is the segment of the population that supports Donald Trump in the United States. It's led to some really negative responses, to breakdown of agencies in Washington which have been doing great work on the environment. It's led to a kind of an anti-intellectual, anti-elite approach. So it is a phenomenon. It is dangerous. I think we're seeing it also, of course, in some European countries in response to perceptions regarding to immigration. Undoubtedly, we're facing new realities, new tensions in Western democracies as a result of this.
Before we wrap, I want to quickly ask each one of you, what is the one big idea that you think is going to definitively shape the coming decades? Let's start with you. One big idea that you believe will definitively shape the coming decades, one big concept or trend.
I believe it's social media. The young are very savvy with social media. If we want to attract more younger people to participate in democracy, then we have to use social media. But social media itself can be very dangerous as well. In some ways, it is spreading certain radical ideas to the people and things like this. So if used in a good way, the social media can be an influential factor in giving us what we want. Makes our life as politicians quite difficult as well, because you know, wherever you are, you can be snapped or whatever. But then again, it's good for transparency, it's good for good governance, it's good that every telephone has a camera, and every smartphone, you know, whatever age you are in, Facebook, Twitter, people are very savvy. So one sort of revolution that's taking place, and which I believe would get more younger people involved in democracy and decision making, would be social media social media.
Right. Dr. Freiberger.
There are going to be a great many concerns that will have to be addressed and solved in the years to come. But an important one, in my eyes, is going to be the question of singularity. In other words, what is the uniqueness of being human as opposed to an algorithm or an application or a program in artificial intelligence? When people are going to go through social media to look for a life partner and fall in love with somebody's picture and CV, that seems the answer to their dreams, and then they discover that it's either a 10-year-old child or somebody who's 80 years old, who's pretending to be, say, a young man in search of a wife. This is going to be one of the practical problems of distinguishing false personalities from real personalities. But essentially, as increasingly electronic, mechanical things are going to replace human beings in terms of their agency and their actions, we will have driverless cars, eventually pilotless planes, factories where at most, already I think in Japan, the car-making factories are all under robots, and the only humans are the ones who clean the floors. Eventually, of course, by now, there must be robots who clean the floors as well. What are humans going to do? And how are we going to be able to preserve the characteristics that distinguish humans from simulacra, from imitations of humanity that we are going to be able to produce artificially? I think it's going to be a difficult problem, and this is where we will need our poets and our artists to remind us of what truly is the essence of being human and what it is that we have to concern ourselves with to preserve our humanity and not to lose it.
The idea or the concept that you think is going to shape the coming decades?
I wish I knew. All I can say is the mind. Human mind has made so many innovations and made so many challenges, because finally, as a follower of the Buddha, I believe you are what your mind can make you. So if we can really be in a position where our minds are such that we can meet up the challenges, we go for a better world. If not, we'll have chaos.
I think it will be fundamental, accelerating, and unpredictable change. In a city like this, which 60 years ago was a sleepy fishing village, now this huge world city with the tallest buildings in the world and traffic, it's an example of how rapidly the world is changing, technologically, demographically, in terms of strategic relationships. And all of this is leaving us and leaving individuals with a huge, huge problem, and that is meaning. I think we came together in small societies 40,000 years ago for meaning. And I'm not sure that our wonderful mega civilization is generating meaning any longer. And I think that is the problem.
Very well said. Thank you so much. I think you've all given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us. Thank you.
Platinum partner, TVS and Torque. Knowledge partner, Amity University, Dubai. State partner, Uttar Pradesh Sarkar. Travel partner, Air India. Hospitality partner, The Oberoi, Dubai. State partner, Madhya Pradesh Shasan. Silver partner, General Insurance Council. Silver partner, Godrej Expert Rich Cream. Print partner, UAE Khalij Times. Print partner, India, The Hindu.